planning is something that we all have to do as homeschool moms. But I want to be really careful because I want to acknowledge the fact that we all plan differently. For a long time, it just took me a long time. We homeschooled for 21 years to realize why I would pick up those normal teacher planning notebooks with the grids in them, and I would have an allergic reaction. And I finally realized it's because I'm a writer and I'm auditory. And so I like narrative ways of being able to explain what happened during our school day or our school week. And it was like my son said when we bought our Suburban, he said, "Mom, you got a Suburban because you don't like to put anything in boxes, including suitcases." And so I did not like the little squares that I was limited to in the grade book. And so we all have our little things when it comes to planning, our quirks and the way that we flourish in our planning. So I want to acknowledge that in the beginning. But here we go. I want to talk about how we can bond as a family and bring our children into the planning process. Here's why I think that's so important. I was asked recently to speak at a convention in Arizona. I think this was last year, and they gave me the topic of pulling in the same direction, creating a family vision for homeschooling. And it's the first time I really thought about the fact in these terms that our vision needs to encompass our children. If we have a vision and they have no vision, then it's no wonder they're saying, "Can I go back to school? Can I do this? Can I do that? My friends are doing this." So we want to make sure we're on the same page and we're pulling our children in to our vision and we're creating a family vision together. This was really driven home for me when I taught. Joe and I founded a co-op back in the 90s in Columbia, which is still going strong. As a matter of fact, our grandkids go to this co-op now. And I used to teach a public speaking class and a biblical worldview class. And that was for high schoolers, and the public speaking was for kids of all ages. And I can remember in one of my classes that had only teens in it, one day I just threw out the question, "Why do your parents homeschool you?" And this was a talkative group. I loved these kids. And all of a sudden, it was like crickets. They were just quiet. And I said, "Okay, somebody give me a reason as to why your parents homeschool you. Why do you like homeschool?" I could not pull a sentence out of any of those kids. So I said, "Okay, you have one homework assignment this week. You go home and you interview your parents and find out why they're homeschooling you. And then I want you to come back with 5 reasons that you're being homeschooled and 5 reasons that you like being homeschooled." And so we'll do that next week. So here's what we did. I had a big whiteboard behind me. I put a big line down the middle and I wrote public on this side and private on this side. So I just had the kids calling out their reasons they homeschooled. Okay, now all of a sudden, public here, private here. And the screen for StreamYard is backwards and it keeps me confused the whole time I'm speaking. And so I would have the kids say, "Okay, give me the reasons you like being homeschooled or the reasons your parents are homeschooling you." And so, of course, the one comes up, "Because I can stay in my pajamas all day long." I said, "Okay, that's a private reason. We're going to write it down on the private side. You like being in your pajamas all day long as you don't have to be anywhere. That's okay." But that's not what you're going to talk about when your pastor or your neighbor or your grandmother or a legislator says, "Why do you like homeschooling?" So I want them to be able to differentiate between what they say where. I can remember the first time we had a camera crew come to our house. My boys were 5 and 7, and they were very at home with the camera crew being there. We had practiced, how you greet people, how you meet people, how you speak to a camera, those types of things. And they did a really good job of that. What I didn't do, I didn't take time to help them prepare their answers because I wanted what they said to be spontaneous and authentic. There's nothing wrong with that. But I learned that day there's a reason that lawyers prepare their witnesses. So they asked my 5-year-old son, who was so sweet and cute, little towhead. He is now a lawyer, by the way. And they asked him, John, why do you like to homeschool? And he says, because I can get a snack and go to the bathroom anytime I want to. And while that was really true, because he had been in preschool where he couldn't do those things before we had ever heard the word homeschooling and started homeschooling in kindergarten, that was important to him. But that's not what we wanted being on the evening news. So that's why we had the differentiation between public and private. And so as we were taking the questions and why do you like certain things about homeschooling, we would differentiate. So then we got into the meat of the topic, and the kids were saying things like, well, my parents want me to love Jesus first and have a biblical education, and then they want me to be prepared for career or for college, those types of things. So then, we're getting into the meat of the matter. We want to have a strong family. We want our siblings to be close. We want to be active, involved citizens. We want to be able to stay up and wait for dad to get home from work without worrying about catching a school bus at 6:30 in the morning. We want to be able to go to the soccer tournament, and even if the game lasts till 1 o'clock, we get home at 1 o'clock in the morning, we can still homeschool. Or you're in the community theater like my daughter was, and sometimes she was Annie one year, and sometimes those rehearsals would go to midnight and she was 10 or 11. And so, you can build your schedule the way you want to build your schedule. And all of those things are valid reasons to homeschool. But I would really encourage you to do this exercise with your children, because we have laid down our lives for our children. You have laid down your lives for your kids. Some of you have given up careers, you've given up second incomes, or you've totally revamped the way you work from home so that you can be there and homeschool your children. We really want our children to understand those things. The fact that we're willing to give up what we want for them speaks volumes as to what they're worth. What they're worth as human beings. And so when we go through these exercises, we can explain all that to them. We can explain our biblical reasons for homeschooling and give them verses. We can explain the educational reasons that we want our families to be close. Whatever is important to you, you need to do. And I encourage you to write those things down. If you don't have a whiteboard, just get a sheet of paper or, one of those big sticky pads. I use these everywhere all the time and have notes all over my office wall about outlines I'm working on and things I need to be doing. So, but you just want to make sure that your children at the end of the day know why you're homeschooling that. And not only know why, but they can articulate those things. It wasn't until my boys were in college, they were home one weekend, and we were sitting around the table, and they started talking about all the times some of our friends, even our old pastor and other people, had sort of taken them to the side. And when Joe and I weren't there, and said, do you really like homeschooling? What do you like about homeschooling? Why are you homeschooled? Are you really learning anything? And you want your children to be prepared for that questioning. Now with COVID, it's so different because, half of the world is homeschooled. But I still think as Christian parents, it's really important for you to go through this exercise where you're articulating to them the reasons and the Bible verses behind your desire to homeschool them. I think that's really an exercise worth doing. This is for free. Also help them with the question, so what'd you do in school today? When you go home to the in-laws or the grandparents' house and somebody will say, well, kids, what'd y'all learn in school this semester? Or what'd you do this week? I can remember we were taking the boys to Washington, D.C., and they each had to choose a monument in D.C. and build a replica of it using Legos or sticks or whatever they wanted to use, popsicle sticks. It was up to them how they wanted to do it, clay, whatever. So we spent all this time studying DC and the landmarks and the monuments. And somebody says to them, well, what have y'all been doing in school lately? Nothing much. And so we don't want our children to give those answers. If they're going home for a family, family reunion or vacation or whatever, help them with those questions. Practice in the car. So, Johnny, what have we been doing in school the last month? Well, if you can't remember, say, remember, we've been studying this in math, and we've been reading these books in literature, and we've been studying this in history. Just give them a few things to say to answer people's questions, because really all of life is an interview, and you're giving them great training for that process. But they will get sometimes more questions than you will get about the homeschooling that goes on in your family. So make sure they're prepared. And then when you're all on the same page and you hit bumps or snags, you have a bad week or a bad month homeschooling, you go back to your family vision and mission statement and you say, okay, this has been a rough month, but let's remind each other this is why we are homeschooling. So we want to make sure that each of your children knows the why of homeschooling. We also we want them to know our goals. And so once you establish the why, your goals are very similar. We wanted our kids to love Christ more than anything else. That was number one. We wanted them to have an education that was fit for them. We had an auditory kinesthetic learner. We had a child who could sit down and read for 6 hours at a time when he was about 8 years old. We had a very active, engaged in the arts learner. So we wanted their education to fit how God had made them. We wanted to have a strong family. We wanted to be able to focus on service projects, and we wanted the kids to grow up being active, involved citizens. So think about each of your children knowing the whys or your vision and your goals. And those two things are really tied together when it comes right down to it. But those are all great discussions to have with your children. They need to discuss the goals with you. They need to discuss the vision with you. Bring them in and make them a part of the conversation. And then they'll surprise you with the things they say to you about why they love homeschooling or the things they've learned. It's amazing how they take off in directions and begin to know things you don't know and begin to have insights you don't have. And I always talk about how the Holy Spirit is our superintendent of education, and he is really amazing at what he teaches our kids and the insights he gives them. So I want to talk to you now about specific planning for each child. And first, I want to do this with you. I want to explain that you need to know the way God has put each child together, because you want to start your planning based on who your children are and where they are, and then implement the scope and sequence chart. And because when you start with the child first, it keeps planning from being a sterile process. So I want to tell you one more story about being in a co-op setting. I was teaching a public speaking class. Both of my boys, who I loved dearly, had just left to go to college about 350 miles away. It was my first year without the two of them, and Lizzie was like 10 years old at the time. So I was teaching a public speaking class to about a dozen 10 to 15-year-old boys, and I just loved it. So one day somebody had given me all these old National Geographic maps. Some of them were like 5 feet by 7 feet in width and height. I mean, they were big maps, and we used them as an impromptu speaking prop. Tell me about the story group in the people group in your map. So as the day went on, we finished up. We had another class coming into our room, and I had to fold up these 30 some odd maps. I have very little spatial relationship skills, so I'm folding up these maps like crazy, and they're each turning out to be about this thick. And I'll never forget Shane, one of the 13-year-olds in my class, comes up to me and he says, "Miss Tyler, give me those maps. I can fold them up." And in about 2 minutes, he had these huge maps folded up into these sleek little folds like they should be. And I said, "Shane, honey, how did you do that?" And he looks at me so sweetly and rolls his eyes and says, "Miss Tyler, you got to fold them the way they're bent." Well, it was interesting because I was doing a study with Chuck Swindoll at the time, by Chuck Swindoll, and he was talking about the verse we always know from Proverbs 22:6. Teach a youth about the way he should go, even when he is old, he will not depart from it. This is what Swindoll said, and to me, it just changed my whole homeschooling life. We might paraphrase the verse to read: adapt the training of your children so it is in keeping with their individual gifts or bents, the God given characteristics built into them at birth. When maturity comes, they will not leave the training they have received. So we want to know what each of our children's bents are. How did God make them? We want to become students of our children, because when we become students of our children, we're partnering with the Holy Spirit in figuring out the education and the time frame and the schedule that is best for each one of them. So you want to start this process with your children in mind first. I want to take a minute just to encourage you. If you've got questions, there's a Q&A session with some of our consultants, part of the party team, at 3:00. I believe it's 3. Yep. I would encourage you to take your questions to that meeting. These women who are consultants and also homeschool moms can answer every question you have. So I would save your questions about curriculum specifically and curriculum plannings and take them to them. But let's talk about a few things. So as you are looking at each child, begin to ask these questions. What is your child's favorite subject? And do this for each child. Have a notebook or your laptop or tablet or whatever you take notes on. And I would encourage you to take several hours one morning or afternoon when you can have a babysitter or your older children watch the littles or whatever, and go through this exercise with each child. Okay. What is your child's favorite subject? What is his or her worst? What is your child's greatest strength or passion? Like Eric Little said, the Olympic gymnast who was a missionary in Japan, a missionary in China, excuse me, but also was an Olympic gold medalist in track. He said, God, he was talking about his strengths, and he said, I know God called me to be a missionary, but he also made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure. So what is it that your child does that when they do it, they feel God's pleasure? So when I talk about a strength or a passion, that's what I mean. What is your child's greatest weakness? I can remember reading a book called Growing Up Learning, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute. When the boys were little, I think it was by Professor of Education Walter Barbie at OSU. And he said this, he said, you'll never find a group of adults operating from their weakness. They'll always operate from their greatest strength. And he said, but what do we do in school? If a child is not strong in math, instead of giving them 20 problems, we give them 100 problems. He said, we need all kids obviously have to have certain math skills, but we need to take into account their strengths and their weaknesses when we're figuring out how much work to assign. I think we need to look at our children's personality types. This is all things you're journaling and writing about. And while there's nothing scriptural about the DISC test, or as Gary Smalley calls it, he's got animals for that: the lion, beaver, otter, and golden retriever. All these personality tests can be helpful if used correctly, because it helps us identify why does our child act this way? Why does he respond to conflict this way? Why does she have this great need to be with people all the time? So the goal of these exercises is just to learn more and more about our children. We're in the next session that we do it for about planning, keeping God in our planning for homeschooling. We'll talk about the importance of identifying our children's spiritual gifts, because I think that's one of the great strengths of homeschooling, is that we can really focus on our kids' spiritual gifts and figure out ways to cooperate with the Holy Spirit in developing those and cultivating those gifts. So when they leave home, they're a gift to their church body, they're a gift to the world, really. But the last thing I want to talk about in terms of studying our kids and knowing their bents is the importance of learning styles. I can remember when we first started homeschooling in 1984, we had this crazy homeschool law in South Carolina, very archaic. It's long since been gone. But I had to use a particular curriculum that a Christian school in our district was using. So this curriculum was not at all suited for my oldest son. But I can remember every morning before I went downstairs, we had enclosed our garage and turned it into a schoolroom to house all of our stuff. And I can remember reading every morning. Have your children put their feet on the floor, their hands on the desk, look you in the eye, raise their hand if they have a question. And it was a very controlled environment, which was great, except for it was not working with my son. And Ty was 6 and John was 4. So every morning I would read this, and my school would not match up with this. I was feeling guilt heaped upon guilt, heaped upon guilt. So I can remember one morning I woke up and I looked at the boys. It was like I had grabbed a drill sergeant's hat and whistle. And I said, okay, guys, today we are having real school in the Tyler household, and this is how it's going to go. So we went down to the schoolroom, and I said, Ty, you will not bounce a ball. You will not walk around. You will not talk while I'm talking. You will have your eyes focused on me. If you have a question, raise your hand. And for John, my 4-year-old, that was easy. But for Ty, it was very difficult. We had the most miserable day of school I think we've ever had in our lives. Ty just never responded to anything. John was so upset because he knew something terribly wrong was wrong with Ty because he wasn't talking. And so I can just remember telling the Lord that night in tears, well, if that's real school, I can't do it that way. And so I'm praying about what to do. Now, you have to remember, give me a little bit of grace here. This is 1984. And this is before, I didn't know anybody in the world who was homeschooling when we started. I was threatened with jail. There were 2 things I said I'd never do in life. One was teach, and the other was have kids. And so here I am, a young homeschooling mom with never having any teacher training, trying to figure out what to do with this child. I was an A student. I had a huge concentration span, and he didn't want to sit still. So as the Lord, just in his very sweet providence, timed things, we had a little birthday party to go to. And I went to this toy boutique where they had the Brio wooden train set. I couldn't afford to buy it for the boys, but they would go play with the train set. And they had this great book nook. So I picked up this book that I referred to earlier called Growing Up Learning. And it was just this man talking about learning styles. This is before the learning style craze, and I had never heard of learning styles. And he just simply said your child learns in one of 3 ways. He's either auditory, he either learns by hearing and talking. He's visual, he's a visual learner, or kinesthetic. He learns by talking and moving. And then he says, woe be unto that poor child who is auditory kinesthetic. He learns by talking and he learns by moving, and neither one of those are acceptable behaviors in the classroom. I'm going, ding, 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 ding. He just described Ty. And he said, let me show you how this works out. He talked about working with a graduate student who came in who had done poorly in high school and college. I don't know how she ended up in grad school, but she wanted to do well. And he said she discovered she was an auditory kinesthetic learner. It took her so much concentration to sit still and focus on somebody talking that she had no bandwidth for learning. And so there again, I'm just going, okay, ding, ding, ding. This is Ty. That's why he was so miserable in school. He had to concentrate so hard on being still and being quiet. He could not hear a word I said during school that day. So I call that Independence Day in our homeschool, where I realized God made Ty this way. Well, today he's a salesman. We always knew he would be an evangelist or a salesman, but whatever he did, he would do with his mouth. And so he's talking and moving all the time at work, and he's a gifted, he just leads people to the Lord. He shares the gospel in season and out of season. And he wasn't meant to sit in a desk in a chair 6 hours a day and learn that way. That's just not how God created him. So look at your children, assess them. Now, I'm not saying I never made Ty sit still. I don't mean to imply that at all, but we need to take into account how our children learn. What is their favorite subject? What is their strength? What is their weakness? What is their personality? All of these things, then we can sit down and begin to draft a plan. And as you plan, again, I think you take out a morning to assess all of your children and what are your character goals, what are your academic goals for them, and then take another afternoon and sit down and figure out which grades are you teaching, which subjects are you teaching in each grade. Will they be parent led? Will they be video courses? Or will they be a combination of each? And let me just say here at this point, if you're struggling with how to implement the flexibility of learning styles into those curriculum choices, or how you schedule all of this going on with so many children, I want to encourage you to find your homeworks consultant. They're the ones who have been in the Q&A this week. We've got about 200 nationwide. Go to homeschoolhelp.com/map. Find your state, and in your state, you'll see little blue dots that have the names of consultants. There are also some black dots with white stars that will have multiple listings. And these consultants will walk you through this process. They are not just selling curriculum. They are homeschool moms who are there to support you, pray with you, answer your questions, help you know how to best create this curriculum or enact this curriculum to fit your particular children. So I just want to say that as you do these things, your child knows why you homeschool. Your child knows the goal of homeschooling. Your child knows who he is and how God made him, and you're becoming a better student of your children. Now you're sitting down figuring out which courses to take, what your school day is going to look like. Are you going to homeschool 6 hours a day, 5 days a week with older children? Are you going to do and then take the summers off? Are you going to teach in the morning with your elementary school kids? Are you going to do it year round? Are you going to do it 4 days a week year round, or all day every day? Are you going to be involved in a co-op? Are you going to be involved in a hybrid school? All of these things you consider as you're planning for your children. But as you bring your children into the process, I can't tell you what a smoother year you will have, because now you've opened the door for your kids to talk to you about, Mom, I'm really struggling with math. Or, Mom, I'm really struggling with homeschooling because all my other kids have gone back to school. All my other friends have gone back to school. So you've opened those doors for those conversations. So those things don't build up in your kids' mind. They know that they can always come and talk to you about the victories they're having, but also the struggles you're having. And there's so much research that has shown that one thing that motivates a child is to feel like he's got a say in what he'll be studying and what the schedule will be. Now, do you give a 5-year-old free rein? Absolutely not. But as your child grows older and they're used to being in dialogue with you and planning with you and talking through these things with you, then you will have a much smoother time of planning and homeschooling year after year after year. It really reminds me of Isaac Watts' hymn. He wrote that hymn, Jesus will reign wherever the sun does its successive journeys run. But in the last verse, he says, let every creature rise and bring peculiar gifts to Christ our King. Each of our children is unique. God has made them each with their strengths and weaknesses and gifts and passions. And they each have peculiar gifts that they will lay at the feet of Jesus, the crowns they will cast before Jesus when we all meet him in heaven one day. And so we want our children to know they're image bearers. God has created them for a reason. We have given up our lives to homeschool them. We believe in their dignity as people, and we're going to do everything we can to help them reach the potential that God has put in them. And I really believe if we approach planning this way, rather than being a chore, it is really the gift that keeps on giving throughout our homeschool careers.